The market that smells wrong. Every morning, the bustling wet market in the city center fills with shouting vendors, clattering scales, and the sharp smell of fresh seafood. Housewives, chefs, and restaurant owners rush to secure the best deals before sunrise. On the surface, it looks like a normal, thriving trade. But behind the chaos, whispers circulate, whispers that not all fish sold here are what they seem. Several buyers had begun to complain that the meat of certain fish looked unusual, the flesh too soft, the color unnaturally bright, and the smell, strangely chemical. Some said the fillets tasted like nothing, as if they had been washed of their essence. A local food inspector, after receiving repeated complaints, decided to quietly investigate. What he discovered was chilling. Some vendors were not selling genuine fish at all. Instead, they were selling processed substitutes, cheap, manufactured imitations shaped and painted to look like real seafood. In some cases, the fish wasn't even from the ocean. The inspector documented his findings carefully, but he knew exposing this practice would be dangerous. These vendors were protected by a network far larger than the average shopper could imagine. And so begins the story of what is truly being sold in plain sight, every morning, under the guise of fresh catch. The inspector began his probe quietly. He bought several kilograms of fish fillets from different stalls in the market, some that looked perfectly fine, others that seemed too perfect. One in particular caught his attention, a bright white fillet, glossy as if polished, with no blood vessels, no bones, not even the faint natural grain of real fish flesh. It looked manufactured. That evening, he placed the fillet under laboratory testing. The first result was startling. The protein levels were far lower than any natural fish. Worse, chemical traces appeared, compounds often used in industrial binding agents, glues, and cheap fillers. The so-called fish was nothing more than a mixture of ground waste meat, starch, and chemical dyes molded into shape. Days later, more evidence surfaced. In another sample, the lab discovered a horrifying detail: the fillet contained traces of pork fat, gelatin, and synthetic flavoring agents. For unsuspecting customers, especially those with dietary restrictions, the health risks were immense. But the scandal went deeper. A contact within the supply chain, speaking anonymously, revealed how these fake fillets were produced. In unregulated warehouses at the city's outskirts, workers processed discarded offcuts of cheap meat and even spoiled fish remains. They ground everything into paste, bleached it with strong chemicals to erase odors, then pressed the mass into fish-like shapes using plastic molds. Finally, artificial fish skin was painted on with edible colorants to make the product appear freshly caught. The profit margins were enormous. A kilo of real fish might cost vendors $6 at wholesale. These fake fillets, less than $1 to produce. Restaurants, catering businesses, and street vendors, many desperate to cut costs, snatched them up without asking questions. The inspector realized he wasn't just dealing with a small scam. This was a growing underground industry feeding unsuspecting families across the city. And the more he uncovered, the more he feared what else might be hiding beneath the ice at the market stalls. The inspector's investigation took a sudden, personal turn when he received a call from the city hospital. A young mother, sobbing uncontrollably, begged to meet him after hearing rumors that he was looking into the strange fish sold in the market. When they met, she told him her story in fragments, each word heavier than the last. 2 weeks earlier, she had bought several kilograms of fillets from a vendor at the market, a vendor who proudly assured her the fish was extra fresh. That night, she prepared a simple stew for her husband and 2 children, ages 6 and 9. Within an hour of dinner, the entire family was violently ill. At first, they assumed it was food poisoning, something that would pass with time. But the symptoms grew worse: dizziness, swelling in the throat, difficulty breathing. By the next morning, the youngest child was rushed into the emergency ward. Doctors managed to stabilize him, but their tests revealed something unusual: high levels of chemical preservatives, far above what is legally allowed in food. Traces of industrial formaldehyde were also detected, a substance normally used to preserve corpses, not to season dinner. The mother's voice cracked as she described watching her children hooked to IV drips, their tiny hands trembling. Her husband's condition lingered for days. He had developed severe ulcers in his stomach lining, burned by the chemical toxins. "We thought we were eating fish," she whispered. But it wasn't fish. It was poison. The inspector quietly collected the leftover fillets from her freezer and rushed them to his laboratory contact. The results confirmed his darkest suspicion. The samples were identical to the synthetic fish he had uncovered earlier, filled with fillers, bleached fibers, and dangerous preservatives meant to extend shelf life unnaturally. The tragedy didn't end there. In hushed conversations with doctors, he learned that this family was not the first. Over the past 6 months, several unexplained cases of acute food poisoning had been admitted to hospitals around the city. Most were dismissed as bad seafood or contaminated water. But when he cross-checked the reports, a disturbing pattern emerged. All the victims had purchased fish from the same cluster of vendors at the market. Now, the inspector knew the problem was no longer just about fraud or money, it was about public safety on a scale that could spiral into catastrophe. But as he prepared to take his findings higher up the chain, a silent warning arrived at his doorstep, a small plastic bag filled with fish fillets, wrapped neatly, but marked with one chilling word scrawled across the packaging in red ink: stop. The inspector could not ignore the threat left at his doorstep. The bag of fish, neatly wrapped, seemed almost mocking, a message sent by people who clearly knew he was digging too deep. He reported it discreetly to his superior at the Food Safety Department, but instead of support, he was met with a cold stare and a half-hearted warning. Drop it. Markets have always had tricks. Don't make enemies you can't handle. It was then he realized something chilling. This network was not just tolerated, it was protected. Determined, he decided to follow the trail himself. Armed with a notebook, a camera, and a small hidden recorder, he returned to the market. He observed carefully, no longer as a customer but as a hunter. The vendors he had flagged before seemed oddly confident, their stalls stacked high with perfect fillets, all identical in size and shape, far too uniform to be natural. When a delivery truck arrived before dawn, he slipped into the shadows and watched as large plastic crates were unloaded, stamped only with vague labels like sea product and frozen goods. That night, he tailed one of the delivery trucks. The vehicle wound its way out of the city and into an industrial zone where dim streetlights barely pierced the darkness. At last, the truck stopped at a warehouse with rusting walls and a faded sign that read, "Cold Storage Limited." But the inspector's instincts told him this was no ordinary cold storage. From his hidden vantage point, he saw men in aprons unloading the crates, moving swiftly and silently. Inside the warehouse, faint mechanical noises could be heard, the grinding of machines, the hiss of steam, the slamming of molds. He caught a glimpse through a broken panel, long tables lined with tubs of pale paste, workers shaping the paste into fish fillets by hand, before dipping them into vats of chemicals. The stench, even from a distance, was nauseating, like ammonia mixed with rotting meat. He snapped a few photographs before retreating, but the images were blurry. To the naked eye, however, there was no doubt, this was a production line for fake fish. In the following days, he dug deeper into the company behind the warehouse. Officially, it was registered as a seafood importer, but its financial records were suspiciously clean, too clean. He found no trace of actual fishing vessels or import shipments. Instead, there were payments routed through shell companies, some linked to powerful businessmen with connections in politics and law enforcement. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. His phone began to ring with anonymous calls that cut off the moment he answered. Strangers seemed to follow him on his way home, their footsteps quickening when he quickened his own. One night, a black van idled near his apartment until sunrise. The inspector began sleeping with his shoes on, ready to flee at a moment's notice. His notes and evidence he hid in 3 separate locations, in case someone tried to erase his work. But the most frightening moment came when he visited a colleague at the lab for more test results. The colleague, a quiet man who had been helping him verify samples, was nowhere to be found. His office was empty, his phone disconnected. Only a single piece of paper remained on his desk, tucked under a stack of files. A photograph of the inspector himself, taken the night he watched the warehouse. On the back, in the same red ink as before, was written, "You've seen too much." The inspector knew he was running out of time. Whoever was behind the fake fish network was not just aware of him, they were circling closer, tightening the grip. His missing colleague was proof enough that silence was their most effective weapon. If he vanished too, the truth would vanish with him. So, he decided to gamble everything on one move, exposing the scandal to the press. He reached out to a seasoned investigative journalist he trusted, someone with a reputation for going after dangerous stories when others looked away. They agreed to meet in a small roadside cafe on the city's outskirts, far from prying eyes. The inspector arrived with a leather satchel packed with evidence, photographs of the warehouse, lab reports proving the chemical contamination, and his detailed notes on the vendors, suppliers, and financial records. The journalist listened silently as the inspector laid it all out. His face paled when he saw the lab reports confirming formaldehyde and industrial bleaches in the so-called fish. When the inspector finished, the journalist muttered, "This isn't just fraud, this is organized crime. If this goes public, it will shake the city." But fate was cruel. As they left the cafe, a black SUV pulled up across the road. The inspector's instincts screamed danger. He shoved the satchel into the journalist's hands and whispered, "If anything happens to me, you publish this. Don't hesitate." Moments later, the SUV's door slid open. A man in a suit, wearing a calm but menacing smile, stepped out. He didn't need to introduce himself. The way the cafe owner froze in place, the way passersby avoided looking in the direction, it was clear this was someone powerful. "You've been busy," the man said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of both a threat and a warning. "But you're playing a game you cannot win. Walk away now, and nothing will happen to you. Keep pushing, and you'll find out what happens to those who don't listen." The inspector said nothing. His silence was answer enough. That night, when he returned home, his apartment door was already ajar. Inside, the place had been turned upside down, drawers ransacked, papers scattered, his computer smashed. On the wall, written in red spray paint, was a single word, "Drown." Panic clawed at his chest, but he refused to give in. He fled immediately, carrying only what he could fit in a backpack. He switched hotels every night, paid in cash, and trusted no one. All the while, he waited for the journalist to publish the story that would blow everything open. But days passed, then a week, and still, silence. No article, no expose, no mention of poisoned families or warehouses of fake fish. Finally, he dialed the journalist's number. It rang endlessly before a cold automated voice answered, "This number is no longer in service." The inspector's blood ran cold. The journalist, just like his colleague, had vanished. And with him, so had the satchel of evidence. Now, the inspector was alone, hunted, and with nothing to prove the horror he had uncovered. All he had left was his memory of what he saw, and the unshakable certainty that the people controlling the market were far more powerful, and far more ruthless, than he had ever imagined. And still, the stalls at the market brimmed with perfect, gleaming fillets, waiting for the next unsuspecting family. The inspector was a hunted man now. His evidence had been stolen, his allies had disappeared, and his name had begun to vanish from official records, hospital logs, public filings, even his own department's roster. It was as though someone was erasing him piece by piece. But he refused to vanish quietly. If anything, the disappearance of the journalist only deepened his resolve. He began looking not at the vendors, but at where the fake fish was ending up. He spent weeks in shadows, trailing trucks and bribing low-level workers who were too scared to speak but too poor to refuse a wad of cash. What he discovered made his stomach churn with rage. This wasn't simply about markets and restaurants. The fake fish had found its way into school cafeterias, hospital kitchens, and even government supply contracts. Cheap, mass-produced fillets were being delivered in bulk to institutions meant to protect and nourish the most vulnerable, children, the sick, and the elderly. One night, he followed a delivery truck to a children's hospital. Through a crack in the kitchen door, he saw trays lined with those same perfect, gleaming fillets, ready to be served to recovering patients. He watched nurses spoon the soft, chemically whitened flesh into soups meant for children with weakened immune systems. His fists clenched so hard his nails drew blood. Later, in a crowded public school cafeteria, he saw lines of hungry children shovel spoonfuls of rice and fish curry into their mouths, completely unaware that what they were eating was stitched together from garbage, bleach, and glue. Some children complained of stomach pain, the teachers dismissed it as overeating. The inspector knew better. When he tried to raise alarms with contacts in the health ministry, he was met with silence, or worse, veiled threats disguised as advice. One official leaned in close during a meeting and whispered, "Do you want to be remembered as a hero, or disappear as a fool? This industry feeds millions. Don't make yourself an enemy of necessity." That was when the inspector understood, the syndicate was not operating in the shadows, it was operating with the blessing of those in power. The fake fish industry had grown too profitable, too deeply entangled with political contracts, and too essential for lining the pockets of men in suits. It was not a small crime. It was a system. The deeper he looked, the darker the web grew. Documents leaked to him by a frightened warehouse worker revealed shipments not just across the city, but across borders. Frozen containers of fake fillets were being exported overseas under false labels, branded as premium seafood, and sold to unsuspecting foreign markets. What began as a local scam was now a global trade in counterfeit fish. But the inspector's victories were small and fleeting. Every source he spoke to either went missing or recanted. Every piece of evidence was stolen, burned, or buried under fabricated paperwork. Even the mother whose child had nearly died from poisoned fish was suddenly silent when he returned to her. She wouldn't open the door, and when he called out her name, her trembling voice answered only once, "Please, don't come here again. They're watching us." By now, the inspector could feel the noose tightening. Men followed him more openly. His phone crackled with strange interference. Even the hotels he switched to felt unsafe, as though the walls themselves had ears. He barely slept. Hunger gnawed at him, but he no longer trusted food from any restaurant. Sometimes, he wondered if even the bottled water he drank was safe. One rainy night, while rifling through dumpsters near the warehouse, he stumbled upon something that froze him in place, a pile of discarded packaging. Among them, a plastic bag labeled, not as fish, but as nutrient substitute, human use. His heart stopped. Were they merely making fake fish, or experimenting with creating synthetic protein intended to replace food altogether? And if so, who was funding it? Thunder cracked overhead, masking the sound of approaching footsteps. By the time he turned, the alley was already closing in with shadows. This was no longer an investigation. It was survival. The inspector always knew this day would come. For weeks he had lived like a fugitive, changing routes, never walking the same street twice, eating only what he could scavenge or buy sealed from trusted stalls. But on that storm-soaked night, with the discarded packaging still clutched in his hand, his luck finally ran out. The shadows moved with precision. Heavy boots splashed through puddles. A hand gripped his collar from behind, yanking him back so hard his breath fled his chest. Before he could cry out, a black hood was shoved over his head, the world plunging into suffocating darkness. His arms were bound, his legs kicked out from under him, and the sound of a van door slamming shut echoed in his ears. Hours, or minutes, he couldn't tell. Later, the hood was ripped away. He sat in a freezing warehouse, hands tied to a metal chair, the air thick with the stench of bleach, fish rot, and industrial chemicals. Around him, men stood in silence, their faces half hidden behind masks. Only one figure remained unmasked, the man in the suit he had seen outside the cafe weeks earlier. The one who had smiled like a viper. "Inspector," the man said, his voice smooth, almost kind. "Do you know how much trouble you've caused us? You've been sniffing around places you don't belong, upsetting a system that feeds millions. Do you understand that?" The inspector spat blood onto the floor. "You're not feeding people," he growled. "You're poisoning them." The man's smile widened. "Poison, or progress? Do you really think this is about tricking housewives at a wet market? What you've seen is just the surface. The truth is, the oceans are dying. Fish stocks collapse year by year. Demand grows, supply dwindles. Real fish is becoming luxury food. What we provide is not a scam, it's the future. Synthetic protein, mass-produced, cheap, efficient. Yes, we cut corners. Yes, we test limits. But one day, all food will be like this. We are just ahead of the curve." The inspector's stomach twisted as the man gestured toward vats bubbling at the far end of the warehouse. Workers stirred pale, unidentifiable slurries, steam rising from chemical baths. On racks nearby lay rows of fillets, identical, gleaming, lifeless. He realized with horror that this was not just about fish anymore. Other molds lined the tables, chicken breasts, pork chops, even slabs resembling beef steaks. "You're lying to people," the inspector said, his voice hoarse. "You're feeding children poison to save money." The man leaned close, his perfume mingling sickly with the reek of bleach. "And yet," he whispered, "those children keep eating. Their parents keep buying. Hospitals keep ordering. Schools keep serving. Governments keep signing contracts. If you think this is about me, or this room, you're still a fool. The network is bigger than you can imagine. Bigger than countries. We don't sell food. We sell necessity. And necessity always wins." The inspector's heart pounded. He realized the man wasn't trying to scare him, he was trying to recruit him. "Work with us," the man said softly. "You're smart, persistent. We need men like you. Keep your life, keep your career. All it costs is silence." The inspector looked down at his hands, rope biting his skin. For a fleeting second, he imagined agreeing, just to escape. But then he saw, in his mind, the faces of the poisoned family, the children in the hospital, the cafeteria trays lined with pale fillets. His silence would make him no better than the monsters standing before him. So he did the one thing they didn't expect. He laughed, a broken, bloodied laugh that echoed in the cold warehouse. "I'll never be part of this. People will know the truth." The man's smile froze. Slowly, he straightened, signaled to the masked men, and turned away. "Take him to the tanks," he ordered. "Let him see what happens to those who cannot adapt." Two men grabbed the inspector by the arms, dragging him across the wet concrete floor. Ahead, the vats bubbled louder, steam rising like breath from some enormous beast. The inspector fought, kicked, twisted, but the ropes bound him too tightly. His boots scraped against the floor as they hauled him closer to the edge. The liquid inside shimmered with a strange, oily film, its color shifting between gray and green. The smell was unbearable, like rotting flesh mixed with chemicals. They shoved his face toward the surface, and in that instant, he saw something that made his blood run ice cold. Floating just beneath the bubbling surface wasn't paste, or fillets, or fish scraps. It was something else, something with fragments of bone. Fragments that looked human. The inspector thrashed violently, his screams echoing against the warehouse walls, then everything went black. When the inspector woke, his throat burned with the acrid taste of chemicals. He was lying on a damp floor, shivering, his clothes soaked, his skin itching as though it had been scrubbed raw. For a moment he thought he was dead, that the bubbling tank had swallowed him whole, but no. He was alive, barely. Dim light flickered above him. He was in another section of the warehouse, separated from the tanks by rusting steel bars. A holding pen, like a cage. His wrists were bruised from the ropes, his head pounded, and his lungs ached as though he had swallowed poison. Through the bars, he saw the vats again. Workers moved methodically, shoveling pale paste into molds, scraping excess into buckets. But what held his eyes was the tank he had been nearly thrown into. The liquid shimmered strangely, carrying lumps and fragments that floated to the surface before being skimmed off with net. One fragment bobbed up close to the rim. For a split second, the inspector's heart stopped. It was unmistakable, a human finger, swollen, pale, stripped of its nail. His stomach lurched. He vomited bile onto the floor. The truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just synthetic food made from waste. They were using human remains. The man in the suit had called it necessity. But what necessity required dissolving human bodies in vats of chemicals, then reshaping them into food? The inspector's mind spun with questions. Were these bodies the missing workers? Dissidents? Anyone who dared oppose them? Was this where his colleague and the journalist had ended up, reduced to paste, fed back to the very people they tried to protect? He clawed at the bars, shouting, but his voice was drowned by the clatter of machines. No one came. No one cared. Hours bled into a haze. His skin burned worse, rashes breaking out where the tank's liquid had splashed on him. Hunger gnawed at his insides, and the bitter irony struck him, they would starve him here, while piles of fake food were stacked just meters away. Eventually, the man in the suit appeared again, his polished shoes echoing across the wet floor. He crouched by the bars, eyes gleaming with something between amusement and pity. "You've seen too much now to walk free," he said quietly. "But you're useful. You've tested the product. You've survived exposure. Do you understand what that means? You're living proof that it works. The body adapts." The inspector spat at him, though his mouth was dry as sand. "You're butchers. Monsters." The man chuckled. "No, Inspector. Monsters are honest. We are visionaries." He leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think we waste our enemies? No, we recycle them. Nothing in this world should go unused. Not even people." With that, he stood, snapped his fingers, and the workers dragged in something wrapped in plastic sheeting. They dropped it with a wet thud near the vat. The inspector's breath caught as the sheet slipped open, revealing a body, bloated, half decomposed, but unmistakably human. Without hesitation, the workers shoved it into the bubbling tank. The liquid hissed as the body sank, flesh melting away almost instantly. The inspector clawed at the bars until his fingers bled, his mind screaming. Every fillet in the markets, every meal in the hospitals and schools, every plate in the restaurants, how many of them had been tainted with this horror? How many had already consumed not just poison, but people? He collapsed against the bars, trembling, as the truth settled in his bones like lead. This was no longer about fake fish. This was cannibalism disguised as commerce. And the world was eating it without knowing. The inspector didn't sleep that night. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the body sinking into the vat, flesh dissolving, bubbles rising as if the tank itself were feeding. His stomach twisted with sickness, but his mind sharpened into a single instinct: escape. He waited. He counted the footsteps of the guards. He memorized the squeak of the door hinges and the rhythm of the machinery. Hours passed like centuries, until finally, at the darkest moment before dawn, opportunity came. A worker approached his cage, carrying a tray. On it sat a bowl of pale, steaming porridge. The smell made him gag, the same synthetic stench, masked with artificial seasoning. The worker slid it under the bars, muttering, "Eat, or die slower." But in that instant, the inspector noticed something. The worker's keyring dangled carelessly at his belt, brushing against the bars. Summoning every ounce of willpower, the inspector forced himself to eat, pretending compliance. The worker leaned closer, smirking as he watched. And then, quick as lightning, the inspector lunged, grabbing the keyring and wrenching it through the bars. The worker shouted, clawing at him, but the inspector slammed the keys against the steel, creating a sharp clang that echoed through the warehouse. The noise startled the man long enough for the inspector to jab the heavy ring into his throat. The worker collapsed, choking. Hands shaking, the inspector unlocked the gate. The hinges squealed like a scream, but he had no time for silence. He bolted. The warehouse was a labyrinth of steam and shadows. He ran past vats that bubbled like cauldrons, past workers too shocked to react, past conveyor belts lined with fake fillets gleaming under cold light. His breath tore through his chest as alarms began to wail. He stumbled into a corridor lined with freezers. One door hung open, and curiosity, morbid, dangerous, pulled him to look inside. What he saw almost brought him to his knees. Dozens of bodies, some whole, some dismembered, stacked like frozen meat. The skin pale, their limbs stiff, their eyes glassy with eternal shock. Tags hung from their wrists, numbers, not names. Among them, his gaze locked onto a face he recognized. The journalist, the man who had promised to publish the truth. His lips were blue, his chest caved in, but it was him. Bagged, tagged, waiting for the vats. The inspector staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, but footsteps thundered closer. Shouts echoed down the corridor. He ran again. He burst through a side door into the rain-soaked night, heart pounding as bullets cracked the air behind him. His feet splashed through mud, his lungs burned, but adrenaline carried him. He vaulted a fence, tore through brush, and disappeared into the maze of the industrial district. For hours, he ran without direction, until his body gave out. He collapsed under a bridge, shivering, soaked, and broken. But alive. As dawn broke, the inspector pressed his forehead against the cold concrete, whispering to himself, "I have to tell them. I have to tell the world." But even as the words left his lips, a sickening thought gnawed at him. Would anyone believe him without evidence? Would they listen to a broken man, hunted, with nothing to show but nightmares burned into his memory? And worse, how many had already eaten the journalist without knowing? How many more would? The inspector curled into himself as the city woke above, his body trembling not from cold, but from the weight of a horror too vast to contain. He had escaped the warehouse. But the syndicates still owned the markets, the schools, the hospitals, the ports. They owned the food, and food was power. The inspector spent 3 days hiding beneath that bridge, nursing wounds, feeding only on rainwater and scraps from trash bins. Every sound felt like footsteps coming for him. Every face on the street seemed to stare too long. He knew he couldn't run forever. He had one choice left: go public. With shaking hands, he wrote everything he remembered: names, places, descriptions of the vats, the freezers, the bodies. He scrawled it across dozens of scraps of paper and smuggled them in plastic bags to church drop boxes, public toilets, anywhere he thought a desperate soul might stumble upon them. He recorded himself on a battered phone, speaking directly into the cracked lens. "If you're seeing this, they've already silenced me. The fish you're eating is not fish. It's waste. It's poison. Sometimes it's worse. You're being fed the dead. And your children are eating it too. He uploaded the files onto hidden servers, sent them to journalists, activists, anyone whose email he could recall from memory. Then he waited. At first, he thought it worked. Whispers spread across online forums. Photos of strange fillets began circulating. A few local news channels aired quick, nervous reports about possible contamination in seafood market. For one brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. But within 24 hours, the stories vanished. Websites were scrubbed, posts deleted, accounts suspended. The news stations retracted their reports, claiming false information. Officials appeared on TV, smiling calmly as they assured the public that all seafood is inspected and safe. And then came the final blow. One evening, as he crept into a dingy roadside diner, the inspector froze. On the television above the counter, a breaking news banner ran. Wanted criminal exposed, disgraced inspector behind fake seafood hoax. His photograph filled the screen, his name plastered across headlines branding him a fraud, a madman, a terrorist attempting to destabilize the food supply chain. The government had flipped the narrative. He wasn't the whistleblower anymore. He was the villain. The inspector staggered back into the rain, hollow inside. He realized the syndicate had won without lifting a finger. They didn't need to kill him. They had erased his truth. That night, starving and broken, he wandered to the edge of the market, the same market where it all began. Stalls gleamed under neon lights, packed with customers. Children tugged at their mothers' arms, begging for fried fish. Vendors shouted cheerfully, weighing fillets identical in shape, shining in unnatural perfection. He stood there, invisible among the crowd, watching as the world ate its own death with smiles on their faces. His voice was gone. His evidence was gone. His allies were gone. And then it struck him, the most terrifying truth of all. It didn't matter if people knew. Even if he screamed the truth in every street, even if the world believed him, what choice did anyone have? The oceans were dying. The markets were filled. The food chain had already been replaced. People would keep eating. Not because they trusted the vendors, but because hunger leaves no room for morality. The inspector turned away, disappearing into the shadows. His story would never be told. His fight had ended in silence. And the markets thrived. The restaurants bustled. The schools served their lunches. The city slept soundly, unaware that in every home, on every plate, beneath the sauces and spices, one secret ingredient had become impossible to avoid. We were already eating each other.